Language awareness, phonology, phonemes, the IPA and drilling. In this presentation, we're going to focus on the basics of phonology and introduce you to some of the main areas that affect the way we work on pronunciation in the classroom. So here are 4 questions. What is phonology? What are the challenges for learners? What is a phoneme? And what's the IPA and why is it useful? So before we go in and look at these things, spend a moment and see if you can come up with some ideas of your own, based on your existing knowledge. Pause the video for a moment, and when you're ready, click to continue. What is phonology? Phonology is the study of speech, sounds, and sound production used in a specific language. What are the challenges for learners? There are many, and we're going to investigate more of them later. But here's a short list. Consonant and vowel sounds, word stress, sentence stress, intonation patterns, and linking, or sometimes called connected speech. What is a phoneme? A phoneme is the smallest unit of meaningful sound in a language. The key word there is meaningful. What's the IPA and why is it useful? The IPA is the International Phonemic Alphabet. It's an alphabet where sounds are represented by symbols. You find IPA transcriptions in dictionaries and in learning materials. This alphabet is not only for English, but it's intended to cover the sounds of most languages. The questions are, should we introduce it to learners? Why could it be useful? What are some of the downsides? So pause the video a moment and think about some answers to those questions, and then click to continue. Should you introduce the IPA to learners? At what age? And is it helpful? Teachers have mixed feelings, particularly with younger learners, but there are some benefits which we should consider first. It can help students to identify and practice sounds through reception and production. Another factor is that it can help our students to identify and discriminate between sounds. It can help them demonstrate features of connected speech, weak forms, linking, etc. And it helps students to record the sounds of words through visual representation of the symbols. It supports learning strategies because it appears in most dictionaries. So by knowing the symbols, learners can better pronounce the words they see. It helps students pronounce words in their dictionaries. This is a good learning strategy. And it can help teachers to correct students by pointing to the chart. But there are some obvious downsides of introducing IPA to younger learners. So while introducing the IPA to students has some benefits for sure, there are some obvious downsides, particularly with younger learners. For younger learners, it's yet another set of symbols they need to learn. It could interfere with learning. Our learners may confuse alphabetic letters with IPA symbols, and it may lead to problems with spelling if the child is too young. Another factor is that there are different forms of transcription. For example, differences between American English and British English. Which one should you use? And you don't need to introduce the whole IPA. You could select a few symbols which are helpful when working on pronunciation in class. So there's some of the background, but now let's look at the IPA in a little bit more detail, understand how it's organized, and what you notice about vowel sounds, about consonants. So take a look at the chart. Study it for a while, pause the video, and if necessary, jot down any ideas or thoughts that you have. When you're ready, click to continue and find out more. But here's a larger version for you to look at while you're thinking. Okay, so let's start with vowels. From the top left, you can see the vowels laid out. You can see that there are long vowel sounds, such as beat, a long E sound. It has 2 dots after it. And there are short vowel sounds. For example, bit, the sound I. Looking at the symbols, you can see some have only 1 and others 2. For example, bit only has 1 symbol, where ear has 2. A vowel with only 1 symbol is called a monophthong. This is a single vowel sound articulated without any change. Beat is an example, and so are book and hut. You've seen that a monophthong is a single vowel sound articulated without any change. I've coloured those orange in the chart below. But there are 2 other vowel types that you should know. Diphthongs. These are coloured blue. These are phonemes that are formed by the glide from one vowel sound to the other. Ear, way, tour, join, coat, air, tie, ouch, schwa. This has a special name because it's the most common sound in English. It's called a weak form, and it's an unstressed vowel sound, drummer, teacher. The example is coloured green. So how do we form vowel sounds? The word vowel comes from Latin and it's related to the word vocalized. Vowel sounds are made by moving the tongue, lips and jaw. The important thing is that the air flows out through the different shapes made by the mouth. It isn't stopped, it's simply expelled. So have a go now. Say the different vowel sounds from the chart and pay attention to the way your mouth positions and how the air flows. Pause the video and then click to continue when you're ready. Now let's look at consonants. So while vowels differ greatly between varieties of English, I speak British English for example, consonants have less variation. And there are 2 broad categories of consonants that you really should know about. Voiced consonants. These come from your mouth and your voice box. And unvoiced consonants come from your mouth. Your voice box doesn't vibrate. Here in the chart, you can see all the English consonant sounds from 21 to 44 in the chart. So let's look a little more at voiced and unvoiced. So there are some simple techniques that you can use to see if you can figure out which ones are voiced and which ones are unvoiced. For example, put your hand on your voice box and say the different sounds. Do you feel any vibration? Now put your hand in front of your mouth. Do you feel air exploding? Next, put your fingers in your ears and say the sounds. What do you feel? Many consonant sounds come in pairs. For example, the sounds P and B are produced in the same place in the mouth. The tongue is in the same position. And the only difference is that P is an unvoiced sound. Did you notice that there is no vibration? P. In the chart below, the voiced consonants are purple and the unvoiced are red. You can see here the relationships between many consonants, but not all. 21 and 22, P and B. 23 and 24, T and D. Continue saying these sounds. Can you feel the difference? You should be aware that this refers only to consonants at the beginning or in the middle of a word. There are different aspects of consonants to understand when they come at the end. And something else. The H sound, H, is often referred to as a voiceless vowel. And sometimes it's silent in words as well. So let's round up. That was a lot of information in a short space. And you may want to clarify some of this information in your group discussion or with your tutor in the online tutorial. So, vowels. They are all voiced, meaning there is a vibration. So, vowels. All vowel sounds are voiced. The position of lips, tongue and jaw and the flow of air through the vocal cords is what makes the sounds. The airflow is not blocked or restricted in some way. Consonants can be voiced or unvoiced, and you saw that they often come in pairs. Voiced consonants are produced the same as vowels, whereas unvoiced are produced without any use of the vocal cords. There's no vibration. The airflow in consonants is blocked or restricted in some way. Let's spend a moment now to think of some practical ways and simple ways that you can develop pronunciation skills in your young learners based on the IPA. Think about your own learners. Are there any sounds they typically confuse? Is it because one of the sounds doesn't exist in Chinese? And what words or pictures could you use to help them in the class? So, minimal pairs. To understand this, you need to remember that a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound which has an effect on meaning. So a minimal pair refers to two words which differ only in one phoneme, and these differences can lead to significant errors in communication. The problems are made worse if one of those sounds doesn't exist in the learner's first language. For example, ship and sheep. You can imagine the confusion. Tree and three. Work and walk. In the classroom, you can practice minimal pairs for sounds that learners often confuse. In the classroom, you can practice minimal pairs for sounds that learners often confuse. Very often, the problem comes from long, short vowel contrasts, as we saw with ship and sheep. It's typical to use pictures to make learners aware of how sound affects meaning, and in fact there are whole courses written around this. People will be seriously confused by errors caused by minimal pair contrasts. The difference between fit and feet, for example. Here's another technique you can use. Drilling. It's a very common technique used in classrooms around the world. It involves the teacher saying a word or a phrase and then the learners repeating it. There are many ways that teachers use drilling, and there are many different types of drills. It's important to know that if it's done badly, drilling is nothing more than meaningless repetition. And you should also be aware that no one learned to communicate successfully from drilling alone. Your job is to develop techniques that give learners the practice of pronunciation they need, but in a fun and meaningful way. Before we look more into the purposes and processes of drilling, pause for a moment and consider what you think the benefits may be for learners. Why would we ask them to repeat language to improve their pronunciation skills? Pause the video and make some notes of your ideas, and then click to continue. The purposes of language drills. Even the word drill sounds mechanical, but despite its often bad reputation, there are numerous potential benefits if it's done well. For example, it gives learners a model they can copy. It's guided repetition of target language. It gives simple mechanical practice in where they need to put their tongue or their lips or how to move the jaw. It develops syntactic awareness through substitution prompts. It develops a memory of grammatical and phonological language patterns and chunks, which provide the basis for language acquisition. And learners often feel more secure practicing sounds in this way, particularly if it's in unison. So what drilling techniques can you use? Well, there are numerous ways to make drilling a useful and fun, and more importantly, meaningful form of language practice. Keep in mind that we can't confuse drilling with real communication, but it's definitely a step on that direction. So here's a very simple sequence that you can adapt and use right now. Say listen, and then model a sound 1 to 3 times. Model it again and use a hand gesture to elicit a repetition. Keep the model consistent, and some teachers prefer to use recordings for this reason. After each attempt by the learners, remodel the sound and elicit a repetition. Point to a group, model the word, and use a hand gesture to elicit a repetition. You could have boys for say, then girls, or table groups, half of the class, lots of ways to mix this up. You could choose a confident individual and model the word for them, and then use a hand gesture to elicit the repetition. Remember to give lots of praise as you do this. Well done, good job, give me a high five. It encourages learners and lets them know they're doing the right thing. This input gives you only a brief introduction to English phonology, and the purpose is to establish some of the basic terms and concepts which will help you to develop your learners' pronunciation in class. And it also gives us a common language so that we can refer to certain things in the future and be sure that you're aware of what they mean. So in the next inputs, you'll look into other, perhaps more critical areas of pronunciation. For example, word and sentence stress and intonation. But before then, let's recap what we covered here. The IPA was the main start. We started by looking at the IPA. We examined what this is and why it could be useful for learners. Teachers have mixed feelings about it, but the phonemic chart is a good resource for you to understand how we define and create phonemes, both vowels and consonants. We then looked at classroom teaching with minimal pairs practice, and we briefly looked into drilling and we'll be looking at more on that in future. Firstly, we looked at the IPA. We examined what it is and why it could be of potential use for learners. Teachers have mixed feelings about it, particularly teachers of young learners, but the phonemic chart is a good resource for you to understand how to define and create phonemes, both vowels and consonants. We also looked very briefly at some classroom teaching techniques, for example minimal pairs practice and drilling. In particular, you saw how drilling has some pros and cons, but ultimately it provides a useful form of controlled pronunciation practice which many learners find helpful. At this stage, you already know that your next task will be to meet and discuss what you've learned through this input. Phonology is a complex area with a lot of new terms and concepts which you may feel unsure about at first. That could be something you want to discuss with your group later or with the tutor in your online tutorial. What other ways of practicing pronunciation do you know or have used in your classes? What do you think the goals of teaching pronunciation are? Is it realistic to expect young foreign language learners to gain native-like pronunciation through your classes? These are all areas you might want to consider and discuss. So, review your notes, and if you want to go back, take a look through the presentation again. Write down any questions, comments or thoughts you have in preparation for your group discussion. I'll be with you next time.